Picture it. The year is 67 AD, and the heart of the Roman Empire beats loudly beneath your feet. You're standing in the Forum, that great open-air stage where senators, merchants, and beggars all share the same sunlit space. The marble columns shimmer in the heat, bronze statues gleam, and somewhere in the distance the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes through the alleyways. But the crowd around you isn't paying attention to commerce or politics today. All eyes are fixed on a figure striding through the square with imperial confidence. It's Nero, Emperor of Rome, dressed in flowing robes dyed the deep purple that only rulers may wear. But it isn't his attire that draws whispers through the throng, it's the figure walking beside him. Draped in silks of the finest weave, jewels catching the afternoon light, the woman moves with the grace of an empress. Yet those who know the truth exchange uneasy glances. That beauty was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him would become one of the most chilling stories of manipulation, obsession, and cruelty in ancient history. At first glance, you might think this is simply another tale of Roman decadence. After all, the empire was famous for its strange indulgences, for rulers who built golden palaces while their people went hungry, for festivals that blended religious reverence with blood sport. But this is something else entirely. This is the story of how grief and unchecked power can twist a human soul, transforming love into possession, and a living person into a mirror of the dead. Sporus's name has largely faded from common memory. No epic poem preserves his voice. No statue honors his life. Yet his fate has haunted historians for centuries, because to understand what happened to him, we must first understand the man at the center of this tragedy. When Nero first ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was just 16 years old, a boy emperor presiding over an empire of 60 million. To many Romans, he seemed the herald of a golden age. Taxes were eased, public games were plentiful, and Nero even performed on stage, charming the common people with his voice and theatrics. His rule began not with tyranny, but with hope. But the same position that placed a crown on his brow also placed a crown of thorns in his mind. Imagine being the only person in an entire empire who could never be contradicted. No friend could speak to you as an equal. No advisor could tell you were wrong without risking their life. That isolation, combined with the ever-present knowledge that countless powerful men coveted your throne, was enough to corrode even the soundest judgment. By 65 AD, something in Nero had shifted, something irreparable. Perhaps it was the constant paranoia that comes with supreme power. Perhaps it was the suffocating isolation of living above the reach of all human connection. Or perhaps it was what happened to the woman he claimed to love above all else, Poppaea Sabina. In her, Nero found not just beauty but a kind of spark that matched his own self-image, radiant, ambitious, and confident. Their union would ignite passion, political upheaval, and ultimately set the stage for the chain of events that would lead to Sporus's fate. But before we reach that point, it's worth remembering, Nero was not born the villain of this story. The transformation from promising young ruler to a man capable of destroying lives with calculated precision was a slow, festering descent. And here in the Forum, watching the emperor walk with the young figure by his side, jewels winking like tiny suns, skin pale beneath the Roman light, you understand something unspoken. You are witnessing not just a strange public display, but the final act of a long tragedy, one that began with a love so consuming it burned through every boundary of reason. The man beside Nero is not merely a companion, he is a ghost in the flesh, resurrected at the emperor's command, and bound to play a role he never chose. Before Sporus, there was Poppaea Sabina, the woman whose beauty and presence would not only captivate Nero but also shape the most dangerous years of his reign. Poppaea was no ordinary figure in the imperial court. Born into a wealthy and politically connected family, she had been raised in a world where charm was as much a weapon as the sword. Ancient writers like Tacitus and Suetonius agreed on one thing: her beauty was legendary, the kind that could stir envy in women and obsession in men. But beauty alone does not survive long in Rome's political theatre. Poppaea paired it with a shrewd, calculating mind. When Nero first saw her, he was already bound to Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. Octavia was the perfect political match, quiet, dignified, and unthreatening. But theirs was a marriage of convenience, not passion. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not. Where Octavia shied from the spotlight, Poppaea embraced it. Where Octavia held her tongue, Poppaea's words could charm or wound in equal measure. In the subtle dances of Roman high society, she was a master. Their affair began as one more scandal in an empire accustomed to such whispers. Yet in Nero's eyes, Poppaea was not merely a mistress. She became an obsession. Ancient accounts suggest that he saw her not only as a lover, but as a reflection of his own imagined grandeur. He lavished her with riches from every corner of the empire, silks from the east, pearls from the Red Sea, perfumes from Arabia, and gemstones wrested from the earth in distant provinces. But these gifts were not acts of generosity alone, they were chains of gold. Poppaea's movements were watched, her interactions with others scrutinized. Nero stationed guards, ostensibly for her protection, but in truth they were his eyes and ears. The palace, with its glittering halls and perfumed chambers, became her gilded cage. Rome at the time was a city of contrasts. The poor crowded into cramped insulae apartments, living with the constant risk of fire or disease. The wealthy elite inhabited sprawling villas adorned with mosaics, fountains, and shaded gardens. For the empress in waiting, life was one of unimaginable luxury, but also unimaginable risk. The same man who poured his devotion into her could, in a moment, turn his imperial authority into a weapon of destruction. Poppaea understood the delicate balance she walked. She used her influence to elevate allies and secure her family's position. This was not greed, it was survival. In the imperial court, fortunes rose and fell on the emperor's whim. Those close to him could enjoy a lifetime of privilege or find themselves exiled to the edges of the empire, stripped of wealth and honor. Marriage to Nero, when it came, was an event staged with the precision of a military campaign. Octavia was divorced, despite her popularity with the Roman people. The wedding itself was a spectacle that fused political statement with personal theatre. Rome had seen imperial weddings before, but never one so drenched in opulence. The streets were lined with banners, musicians played from dawn until deep into the night, and feasts spilled into the public squares. For the people, it was entertainment. For Nero, it was a declaration. This was the woman he had chosen, the partner who would share his throne and his life. And yet, beneath the glitter and celebration, the seeds of tragedy were already sown. Nero's love for Poppaea was not the steady devotion of a man who cherished his wife as an equal. It was the burning possession of a ruler who saw her as his creation, his mirror, and ultimately his property. And in the court of Rome, property, no matter how beautiful, could be destroyed as easily as it was acquired. From the moment Nero placed the imperial crown upon Poppaea Sabina's head, the relationship between husband and wife became less a union of two people, and more a performance staged for one audience, Nero himself. His adoration was relentless, a constant force that shifted from passion to suffocating control. Poppaea, once the bright jewel of Rome's elite, now glittered in the darkness of a cage so lavish it fooled outsiders into thinking it was paradise. Nero's gifts grew more extravagant, almost theatrical in their excess. He commissioned master craftsmen to create jewelry that could rival the treasures of Cleopatra, necklaces strung with pearls the size of grapes, rings inset with sapphires so deep they seemed to contain the night sky. The imperial treasuries drained to feed his desire to surround her with tokens of his love. Silks dyed in Tyrian purple, so rare and costly they were worth more than gold by weight, draped her form. Perfumes distilled from frankincense and myrrh clung to her skin, their scent lingering long after she had left a room. But these adornments were not mere luxuries. They were tools of ownership, symbols of a man rewriting the world to match his vision. Each new portrait commissioned, each marble bust carved in her likeness was not just a celebration of her beauty, it was an attempt to fix her in time, to hold her exactly as he wished her to be. Nero's possessiveness soon began to reshape Poppaea's reality. The friends who had shared her laughter in earlier years found themselves turned away at the palace gates. Family visits grew rarer, restricted to carefully monitored occasions. Even the servants who attended her were chosen not for loyalty to her, but for devotion to Nero. The emperor was building a court within a court, an inner circle where every voice echoed his own. It was not only Poppaea's physical movements that Nero sought to control, it was her very image. In public ceremonies, she was displayed like a living goddess, her appearance meticulously planned to stir awe among the people. The rituals of the imperial court became showcases of her perfection, spectacles designed to remind all of Rome that she belonged to him alone. Poppaea, however, was not a passive figure in this grand design. Her intelligence and political instinct allowed her to maneuver within the narrow space. Nero's obsession left her. She secured positions for her allies, advanced her family's standing, and ensured that those closest to her owed their fortunes to her influence. This web of connections was her insurance policy, a shield against the emperor's unpredictable moods. Yet there was one quality that set her apart from the sycophants who filled the palace halls. She was not afraid to speak her mind. Poppaea could challenge Nero in ways others dared not, whether in matters of policy or in critiquing his endless artistic performances. At times she laughed at his theatrical excesses, not cruelly, but with the familiarity of one who knew the man behind the mask. To an emperor accustomed to absolute obedience, this was both intoxicating and dangerous. He loved her spirit, but each spark of defiance fed the darker currents of his possessiveness. Every disagreement, however minor, was a reminder that she was not entirely his creation, that some part of her remained her own. The balance could not hold forever. Beneath the surface of their glittering public life, tension was building, slow and unseen like water pressing against a dam. And when it finally broke, the flood would sweep away not only Poppaea's life but the last tether holding Nero to reality. The summer of 65 AD should have been a season of triumph for Nero. Rome's streets were alive with the scents of fresh figs and warm bread, the air buzzing with rumors of upcoming games and theatrical performances. In the imperial palace, marble floors gleamed in the afternoon light, and the private gardens overflowed with roses brought from distant provinces. Yet behind these walls, in the most opulent rooms of the empire, the seeds of tragedy had already taken root. The exact spark is lost to history, ancient writers disagree. Some say Nero had returned late from the chariot races, flushed with excitement, reeking of sweat and horse leather, while Poppaea waited with questions that cut into his pride. Others insist the quarrel began with his theatre obsession, a subject that could ignite Poppaea's scorn faster than any political dispute. Tacitus, never shy about imperial scandal, claims she accused him outright of caring more for his public image than his duties as a husband and father. What we do know is this: Poppaea was pregnant. The child she carried might have been their second together, a long-hoped-for heir. In Roman culture, the promise of a son was no small matter. It could secure dynasties and rewrite the political future of the empire. That unborn life should have been a thread binding them closer. Instead, it became the backdrop for the moment that would shatter everything. The argument escalated, words became sharper, their tones rising like clashing cymbals in the quiet of the palace. To the guards stationed outside, it must have sounded like any marital dispute until the sound changed. There was a movement, sudden and violent. Some sources speak of a single, brutal kick to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained assault, rage unleashed without thought or mercy. What is certain is that the force was enough to cause catastrophic injury. The marble floor, cool and white, must have seemed like ice against her skin as she fell. Servants rushed in, frozen between fear for their mistress and terror of the emperor. Nero's face so often, the mask of command was now twisted in the dawning realization of what he had done. The man who commanded legions, who could have any citizen executed with a word, was suddenly powerless. He knelt beside her, babbling desperate pleas and orders in the same breath, begging her to live, commanding her to obey as though imperial authority might reach beyond death. Physicians were summoned from every corner of the city, bribed with fortunes, threatened with torture. But the medicine of ancient Rome had no cure for such wounds. Poppaea died within hours. The unborn child died with her. And in that moment, something inside Nero gave way completely. His grief was not the quiet sorrow of a man in mourning. It was the frenzied grief of someone unmoored from reality. He refused the traditional cremation of Roman aristocracy. Instead, he had her body embalmed, entombed in a mausoleum more lavish than those of many emperors. He declared her divine, establishing a cult in her honor, and filled the palace with offerings, as if she might walk through its halls again. For days, some say weeks, he spoke to her body as though she still breathed. Courtiers were forced to play along with the delusion, speaking of her in the present tense, leaving her place set at imperial banquets, and pretending not to notice the stench of decay beneath the perfume. It was in this surreal twilight of grief that Nero's eyes first fell upon Sporus. The young man could not have known that, in that instant, his life was no longer his own. Sporus was likely no more than 14 or 15 when Nero noticed him. By Roman standards, he had already lived an unusual life. Born into slavery within the imperial household, he had been freed while still a child, a rare privilege. As a freedman under the emperor's patronage, he had access to education that most freeborn citizens could only dream of. Training in reading and writing, the art of rhetoric, the basics of administration. This prepared him for a life of service in the intricate machinery of the palace. Yet freedom in the imperial court was never absolute. A freedman's fortunes rose and fell entirely at the whim of his former master. Imperial favor could elevate a man to unimaginable influence or reduce him to nothing overnight. Every smile from the emperor was a gift, every frown a potential death sentence. What drew Nero's gaze to Sporus was not his skill or wit, but his face. Ancient sources agree, though they differ on almost every other detail, that Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the late Poppaea Sabina. Not merely a passing likeness, but a symmetry of features so precise that it felt unsettling. The arch of the brow, the fine bone structure, the shape of the eyes. In a culture where physical resemblance was sometimes seen as a sign of divine will or reincarnation, this was more than coincidence, it was omen. For a man drowning in grief, that resemblance was a lifeline to the past. Nero's mind, already strained by guilt and isolation, seemed to twist this chance encounter into something far more than it was. To him, Sporus wasn't simply a youth with a familiar face. He was an opportunity to undo the irreversible, to summon Poppaea back from the grave in flesh and blood. There was, of course, one obstacle. Sporus was male. But Nero was an emperor who fancied himself divine, whose will had bent the world to his whims. The idea that gender could be an unchangeable fact was, to him, a trivial limitation. He had spoken to a corpse as though it were alive. Why should transforming a boy into a woman be any more impossible? What followed was not an act of passion, but of calculation. Nero did not simply order Sporus to dress like a woman. He resolved to make the transformation permanent. This was not just about appearance, it was about erasing Sporus's identity entirely, reshaping him into a vessel for someone else's ghost. The imperial physicians, men accustomed to treating battle wounds and fever, now found themselves tasked with a procedure meant to alter a human being at the most fundamental level. In the ancient world, such surgeries were brutal and perilous. Without modern anesthesia or antiseptic, they relied on crude instruments, herbal sedatives, and the hope that the patient's body could endure the trauma. Mortality rates were high. Even survival meant a lifetime of physical pain and social stigma. For Sporus, there was no choice. Refusal would have meant death swift, public, and without honor. Submission meant living, but living as something else, someone else. And so, within the secluded quarters of the imperial palace, the process began. Outside, Rome bustled with its usual life. Merchants haggling in the markets, senators debating in the curia, laborers hauling stone for Nero's latest grand building project. Inside, in rooms muffled by heavy curtains, a boy's life as he knew it was being dismantled. The day would come when Sporus emerged from this ordeal not as himself, but as the image of a dead empress. And from that moment on, he would never again be permitted to exist simply as Sporus. What Nero demanded of Sporus was more than physical alteration. It was the destruction of a person's identity and the careful construction of another's, lese. The surgery itself, performed in the private chambers of the imperial palace, would have been a grim affair. There were no sterile instruments, no clean white sheets, no chloroform to blur the agony. Bronze scalpels, heated in open flames, were the tools of the trade. Thick cloths served as restraints. Crude herbal concoctions dulled the pain, only enough to keep the victim conscious. Sporus would have been held down by guards, while the imperial physicians worked. The air heavy with incense to mask the metallic tang of blood, the muffled sounds of Rome drifting in through distant windows. It must have felt like the world had narrowed to nothing but pain. Whether he survived because of his youth, the skill of the doctors, or sheer willpower, we cannot know, but survive he did. The physical recovery would take weeks, perhaps months. Bandages changed daily, wounds washed with wine or vinegar in the hope of warding off infection. Even as his body healed, the transformation was far from over. Nero was not content with simple resemblance. He wanted a living replica of Poppaea, someone who could stand beside him in public and convince the world that she had, in some miraculous form, returned. The next phase was one of relentless conditioning. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress. The name was not just symbolic, it was a public declaration that he was no longer himself. His quarters were moved to a section of the palace reserved for women of high rank, surrounded by attendants trained to cater to every need while ensuring absolute compliance. Imperial seamstresses worked tirelessly to create gowns that would flatter his altered figure and disguise what remained of his masculine frame. Jewels once worn by Poppaea were pressed into his hands, each one a glittering shackle. They were not adornments chosen for beauty's sake, but relics of a role he was now forced to play. Cosmetic artists taught him how to powder his skin, how to redden his cheeks, how to line his eyes with kohl to give them the same almond-shaped allure that had once entranced the emperor. Hairdressers spent hours each day curling and pinning his hair into elaborate styles, the metal tools heated over open flames, the scent of singed hair lingering in the air. Then came the lessons in movement and voice. Tutors drilled him in the art of walking with the measured grace of a Roman matron, of sitting with feet tucked just so, of letting his hands rest lightly in his lap. He was trained to lower his voice to a softer register, to avoid the direct, assertive tone expected of Roman men, and to adopt the lilting cadence of feminine speech. Every gesture, every glance, was rehearsed until it became second nature, or at least appeared so. This was not merely about convincing others, it was about convincing Nero himself. The emperor, deep in his delusion, expected not just a physical likeness but the mannerisms, expressions, and very presence of Poppaea Sabina. And so, day by day, the boy named Sporus vanished. In his place emerged the carefully curated image of a woman who no longer existed. One can only imagine the psychological toll. Every mirror reflected not the person he knew himself to be, but a stranger's face. Every compliment from the emperor was praise for someone else's ghost. Each lesson, each costume, each smile was another layer of erasure. And in the heart of the most powerful empire in the world, surrounded by marble, gold, and the unblinking gaze of his captor, Sporus had no way out. By the spring of 67 AD, the transformation was complete, or at least complete enough for Nero to stage the spectacle he had been building toward. The wedding between the Emperor of Rome and the newly christened Sabina would not be a quiet palace affair. It would be an imperial event designed to etch this union into the memory of the empire. The date was chosen to coincide with a cluster of religious festivals, ensuring the city would already be alive with celebration. Nero understood the value of spectacle. Every gesture, every flourish, would serve both to satisfy his own fantasy and to signal his absolute authority to the world. The ceremony was held in one of the largest palace halls, its marble walls draped with silks imported from the east, their deep crimson and gold shimmering in the light of thousands of oil lamps. Flowers from across the provinces, white lilies from Campania, roses from Alexandria were arranged in towering displays that filled the air with their heavy perfume. Musicians tuned lyres and flutes, ready to play the same traditional wedding songs that had echoed in Rome for centuries. Sporus, in his role as Sabina, was adorned in a bridal gown of layered silk, each fold meticulously arranged to flatter the figure Nero had ordered into existence. Around his neck rested a necklace of pearls once worn by Poppaea herself. On his head, a delicate golden crown shaped in the form of laurel leaves. Every detail was deliberate, a resurrection in clothing and jewels. The ceremony followed the rituals of a traditional Roman wedding, though the meaning was grotesquely inverted. Hands were joined in the dextrarum iunctio, the symbolic clasp of unity. Sacred bread was shared, as if this were a true joining of husband and wife. Legal documents were signed, making the union official under Roman law. To those who had not heard the whispers, it might have looked like the wedding of a beloved empress returned from the dead. To those who knew, it was something else entirely, an act of public theatre so strange and unsettling that it silenced even the jaded tongues of the aristocracy. Guests played their parts well. They offered gifts, gold, ivory, rare fabrics, bowing low, congratulating the emperor, and addressing Sporus by his new name. But beneath the polite smiles, the room must have pulsed with unease. This was not merely an eccentricity, it was a demonstration of the emperor's power to redefine reality itself. After the vows were spoken, and the feasting began, Nero paraded his new bride through the palace, showing him off to foreign dignitaries and Roman elites alike. To all appearances, Sporus was now the Empress of Rome, complete with her own household staff, retinue, and the privileges of imperial rank. But the luxury was a veneer. Every gift, every courtesy, was bound to the role he had been forced to inhabit. This was not a life, it was an endless performance, with no curtain call in sight. And in Nero's mind, there was no distinction between Sporus and the woman he had lost. When he looked at his new wife, he did not see a young man reshaped by pain. He saw only Poppaea Sabina, reborn to serve him again. Once the spectacle of the wedding faded, Sporus's existence settled into a strange, gilded monotony. Outwardly, he was the most powerful woman in the empire, draped in silks, attended by handmaidens, seated beside the emperor during public appearances. In reality, every movement, every word, was scripted by Nero's will. Days began with the rituals of transformation. Servants entered his chambers at dawn, drawing back the curtains to let in the pale Roman sunlight. Bath attendants prepared warm pools scented with rose oil, scrubbing and perfuming him until his skin gleamed. The imperial hairdressers, often the same who had served Poppaea, spent hours shaping his hair into elaborate styles, fastening it with ivory pins inlaid with gold. Wardrobe choices were not Sporus's to make. Nero selected his attire as a painter selects colors for a portrait, each gown chosen to echo something Poppaea had once worn. Even the jewelry was arranged with symbolic precision, rings that had been gifts from foreign kings, bracelets blessed by priests in distant temples, all worn as if they carried the same memories for Sporus as they had for the dead empress. Public appearances were frequent. Nero, intoxicated by his own theatre, paraded Sporus at gladiatorial games, chariot races, and state ceremonies. Seated in the imperial box, Sporus was expected to smile, wave, and offer polite conversation to senators and foreign envoys. The eyes of the empire were always upon him, searching for signs of Poppaea in his gestures. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was more suffocating. Nero's moods could swing without warning, from affectionate indulgence to sudden, irrational rage. At times, he would reminisce about moments he had shared with Poppaea, speaking to Sporus as if he had been there, as if the memories belonged to him. Other times, he would demand that Sporus repeat phrases or gestures exactly as Poppaea once had, punishing any deviation with cold silence or cutting words. Despite the constraints, Sporus learned to navigate his role with care. He mastered the art of listening more than speaking, offering responses that flattered without drawing suspicion. His survival depended on reading Nero's temper, like a sailor reads the wind, adjusting his tone, posture, and expression to match the emperor's shifting moods. In these rare moments of privacy, one question must have haunted him. Did anyone truly see him? The palace was full of people, slaves, freedmen, guards, musicians, courtiers, but all saw only the mask. The young man named Sporus had been erased so thoroughly that even he could barely remember what it felt like to live without this role. Outside the palace, Rome was changing. Discontent was simmering in the provinces, whispers of rebellion spreading through the legions. But inside the imperial walls, Nero seemed deaf to the growing unrest. His world revolved entirely around his art, his spectacles, and the fragile illusion that Poppaea Sabina still lived, reborn in the body of a boy who had no choice. By the spring of 68 AD, the foundations of Nero's empire were cracking. Provinces that had once sent Rome tribute now sent defiance. In Gaul, the governor Gaius Julius Vindex openly rebelled, rallying troops under the banner of liberation from Nero's rule. In Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, an older, respected general, declared himself the true emperor. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors of the throne, began murmuring about loyalty to the state rather than to Nero himself. Nero's response was to retreat deeper into fantasy. While Rome's frontiers burned with rebellion, he was rehearsing for stage performances, planning musical tours through Greece, and holding chariot races in the imperial gardens. Sporus remained at his side throughout it, all still paraded at public events, still dressed as Poppaea, still addressed as empress in official settings. To the watching world, the sight had become almost unbearably surreal. An emperor on the brink of losing his empire, clinging to a phantom bride. But even within the palace, the atmosphere had shifted. Courtiers who once laughed at Nero's jokes now watched him with calculating eyes. Friends slipped away without farewell. Gifts to Sporus became fewer and more perfunctory. Servants whispered in corridors when they thought no one was listening. The illusion was beginning to crumble. The breaking point came in early June of 68. The Praetorian Guard, once the iron shield around the emperor, declared allegiance to Galba. Deserted by his protectors, Nero fled the palace in the dead of night, taking only a handful of loyal attendants. Among them was Sporus. Perhaps Nero believed the boy could still anchor him to some sense of love or stability. Or perhaps, even in flight, he could not bear to leave behind his living memory of Poppaea. They traveled in secrecy, disguised in worn cloaks, slipping through Rome's streets toward a villa outside the city. For Nero, it must have been a dizzying descent from the marble halls of the Palatine to a fugitive's shadows. For Sporus, there was no real change. He had always been a prisoner, only the walls had changed. In the villa, Nero learned that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. Capture meant humiliation, torture, and execution. Rather than face that fate, he decided to take his own life. The only problem was that the self-styled god of Rome had no courage for the act. His hands shook. He could not drive the blade into his own throat. It was one of his freedmen, Epaphroditus, who finally guided the dagger home. As the life drained from the man who had ruled the empire, Sporus, still dressed in the garments of an empress, watched the scene unfold. It must have been a moment of staggering contradiction. The end of the emperor who had destroyed his life, and with it, the collapse of the strange, poisonous world that had held him captive. But freedom was not waiting for him outside those villa walls. With Nero's death, the empire lurched into chaos. The year of the 4 emperors had begun a violent carousel of power struggles, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. In such times, imperial favorites rarely survived long. Sporus, now stripped of his title as empress, was not simply free to vanish into obscurity. His beauty, his notoriety, and his peculiar history made him both valuable and vulnerable. Those who claimed power in Rome saw in him more than just a person. They saw a political symbol, a living trophy tied to the memory of the last Julio-Claudian emperor. Galba, Nero's immediate successor, had little interest in Sporus personally, but Otho, the man who would seize the throne after Galba's assassination, saw opportunity. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina, before Nero took her for himself. The irony was almost theatrical. Now he could parade Poppaea's ghost at his side, turning a private humiliation into a public display of dominance over Nero's memory. And so Sporus was once again installed in luxury, this time in Otho's household. The costumes returned, the jewels reappeared, the role was revived. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he fell to Vitellius. Sporus's life was once again handed from one ruler to another, like a prize in a game he had never chosen to play. Vitellius, coarse and fond of cruel entertainment, saw a different use for him. Ancient sources claim that Vitellius planned a public spectacle, one that would end with Sporus's death. The details are murky, but the intention was unmistakable: to reenact the myth of Proserpina's descent into the underworld, with Sporus forced to play the maiden, abducted by Pluto. In the Roman arena, such plays were not symbolic, they were executions staged as myth. For Sporus, this was the final degradation. After years of being dressed, trained, and displayed as an empress, he was now to be murdered for the amusement of the crowd, his life ending as a grotesque parody of the role he had been forced to live. Facing this fate, Sporus chose his own exit. Rather than walk into the arena, he took his own life, how the sources do not say. But in that act, he denied Vitellius his cruel spectacle. The boy who had once been remade in the image of an empress, who had been paraded through Rome's palaces and streets as a ghost in flesh, ended his story in obscurity, without a monument or a grave known to history. And yet, in the writings of Rome's historians, his name endured not as himself, but as a reflection of the men who had possessed him. A life that had never been his own was finally, in death, his alone,